Good evening, everybody. This is Ida, and tonight I am very privileged to be able to speak with a friend of mine, Jona Bryndis. And she's someone you might be familiar with. She's the director of the counseling service. It's called Transcodes, and the website is transcodes.com. Jona, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Hi, Ida.
Hi.
Thank you for inviting me to your show. Hopefully very soon.
Yeah, let's hope. Well, okay, now I'm going to do a little quick introduction, and then we'll just have some fun. You are a person with an interesting background. Your background is in science. One would not expect that of a person who is an energy coach and works in spiritual counseling, but it is a scientific background, and you have a nice personal story, and it includes, a lot of experience that made you wise in certain ways. And I wonder if we could just start by talking just a little bit for a few minutes about you, what you came from, what you went through, how you came to this. Would that be good?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Go ahead. Let's go.
So my personal background is that I was born in Iceland, which is a country that has a very high standard of living, but also a very high rate of alcoholism. And there's a reason why I'm mentioning this right off the bat, because that determined my childhood, more or less. So my background is basically in a alcoholic family, addictive structure system. And the reason why I bring this up is because a lot of my clients have similar stories. But as far as like my personal experiences goes, when you live or when you grow up in a family where things are not 100% safe, where how your mom or how your dad is going to react or what mood they're going to be in today is very unpredictable and can lead to like really unsafe situations, whether it's physical or emotional, then a child typically develops one out of two talents, I want to call it. One would be numbing down, shutting down, trying to avoid contact, trying to evade any type of potential confrontation. And the other one would be to become a really good energy reader.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that.
Yep, to like know what the mood is, what the energy is within the family, the moment dad or mom walks in the door, and to kind of evaluate where this is going to go and what kind of protective measures the child has to take. And this is something very common in the majority of my clients who want or need to talk about their energetic sensitivity have similar stories. So the reason why I'm talking to you here today and why I'm doing the job that I'm doing is because I had a very traumatic childhood in that respect. This, of course, then duplicated throughout my teenage years and my college years and, of course, my relationships. So most of my friends and boyfriends, if I may say so, before I got married, all had addictive structure. And of course, my first husband was an alcoholic. So this is like a typical career of a child grows up in an addictive family. We feel so familiar with all the drama and the chaos and the abuse that is going on that we kind of feel attracted to it, unfortunately. And so our whole sense of what's normal becomes so askew that all those talents that we've been developing throughout our entire childhood becomes so strong that this is like how we see the world. And this is me.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to, go too deep into the sob part of it. It really doesn't matter. What matters is really what happened to me as a person. So when it came to schooling and education, I was educated in Germany. I felt much safer in the mental realm.
Uh-huh.
To go to like real into like super rational,
Mm-hmm.
circles. All my friends were like hyper intellectual, and I went to university for chemistry, out of all sciences, where there's like no other women. So I felt like really safe in places or with people who were just really mental. And that kind of, was sort of the first stage of my development, was going in the extreme opposite, to just sort of focus on intellectual or cognitive abilities, and to completely fade all my energetic perception out.
That's fascinating. It is. My goodness. And it's it's like looking at the full picture. It's such an understandable forming. It formed you in that strange way. Even though it was abusive, it still formed you to be the person that you are today, to help people in the way that you do.
Well, and you see, Ida, that's exactly kind of what also qualifies me to do this work, because in the end, anybody who has experienced trauma, and I'm not just speaking from a counseling point of view here, because counseling has a different approach, but anybody who's experienced trauma, who has a certain setup in their life, it requires to evolve out of the circumstances, and in order to not get caught up with the drama of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really difficult sometimes because of what I mentioned earlier, like the way we perceive what's normal.
Right.
What's normal is in reality so dysfunctional that there is no way for us to tell actually it was normal. And when doing this work, and this is kind of like where my dedication is helping people to recontextualize those things, no matter what it is that they've developed as a result of that. Most of us, all of us, we don't need to have a traumatic life or childhood to develop certain coping mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
But those coping mechanisms are typically really cool talents that were out of necessity kind of misused for safety, for attention, for manipulation. So what in actuality is actually a cool trait to have, like I mentioned earlier, people who grow up in sort of traumatic or difficult childhoods become good energy readers.
Right.
What originally was a really cool trait was then abused by ourselves to cope, to protect ourselves, to manipulate others so that we could stay safe. And later in life, those things are not really needed anymore. And that's when the problem occurs. It makes us very difficult relationship partners. It makes it very difficult for us to commit to trust people with sort of these backgrounds. And you know what? I'm actually talking about 90% of the people here. And even those who didn't have a traumatic childhood typically experienced something like that along the way.
It has to, looking, you said 90%. I didn't have a traumatic background, and I was going to ask you about this, an inner voice, a harshly critical inner voice.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine you have one, having experienced that. I didn't experience abuse per se, but I experienced kind of a heavy pressure of religious indoctrination that provided that. And could you talk a little bit about how you talked to yourself, how you viewed yourself, and how you healed through that kind of a thing? Your own opinion of yourself. Was it always good? Was it?
No,
Yeah.
totally dysfunctional.
Yeah, totally. I would think so. Yes.
I mean, that's what I mean with this like skewed sense of normalcy. The critical inner voice, which is, a really big theme right now, for many people, because it's something that is now even scientifically known to prevent success, to prevent happy relationships and so forth. When you talk about trauma, or I talk about trauma, and you don't really have to have been physically or sexually abused, mental or emotional abuse is actually so common that it's typically not even acknowledged as abuse, unless it's in an extreme form. But depending on what kind of cultural background we come from, religious background, as you mentioned, and you can imagine, I mean, what's okay in this country is not okay in this country,
Yes.
and or culture. So depending on where we're from, the degrees of abuse, or sort of, like, if you put it in a more neutral way, threat that we experience, that's totally subjective. So there doesn't have to be like a restraint order,
Yes, exactly.
for a person to be traumatized. So verbal abuse and emotional abuse is actually, I think the number is even higher than 90%, because a lot of societies, and if we take American society as an example, are based on sort of false self-projections, like what our neighbors think, what the community thinks, so there's a lot of comparison, a lot of competition, a lot of approval, external approval needed. And that kind of scenario creates actually a traumatic background for a child, because it prevents a person from truly connecting with themselves in an early age. And if a person misses out on that inner connection, not to mention on the deep emotional connection with the parents, that if it's more important what the neighbors think, then that deep connection with parents can't take place either. If we miss out on that at a certain stage of development, then that creates a whole sort of set of intimacy issues and commitment and relationship problems later. So trauma is relative. The way I handle it in my counseling work or coaching work is that trauma is subjective. All right. If a child perceives a threat because their lollipop was taken away from their mom when they were 1.5 years old, that trauma is stored in that person's energy system, or can be stored in that personal energy system, exactly like a 1.5-year-old that has almost been beaten to death. Okay. Other things, trauma memories that store in our energy field are things like circumcision, for example.
Oh, my.
And even prenatal things. So that's kind of like, where the energy coaching comes into place. So we're not just talking about typical sort of counseling issues or behavioral or psychological issues. And I like working together with counselors. And I'm actually training counselors also, because it's a cool addition to their work. But when you do energy coaching, you go deeper and help a person to recontextualize
I can see how that would
their
really,
experiences.
really help. Yeah. It really, just talking to you now is helpful to me. How did you deal with when you started to started to have a look at, at some point in your time, you must have come to deal with the inner child. What was your inner child acting like?
Inner child was that's a really, really good question. Because to tell you the truth, at some point of a person's journey, everyone is going to have to deal with their inner child to one degree or another. Personally, inner child was probably the first sort of major spiritual, emotional healing work that I engaged in. Um, Now, I have to say, due to, sort of my collective inheritance, with the family lineages of alcoholism and so forth, addictive structure, I was also exposed to the 12-step program very early in my life. Not so much that I went there myself, but pretty much everyone I knew was either alcoholic or ex-alcoholic.
Okay.
So most of my friends today are still like mostly were alcoholics or addicts of any sort in recovery. So I was confronted with some of those healing tools that come like through AA, Al-Anon, and so forth, those self-healing group work, without actually knowing. And the way it's handled there is that, yes, it's all part of our story, but at the end of the day, we need to learn how to transcend that. And somehow that stuck with me. And after having tried to transcend some of the issues that I have with my mother still today, my father committed suicide when I was 18 years old. So there's very little chance of reconciliation there. But after having tried many times to actually resolve or reconcile with my mother, which didn't work for many different reasons. I'm not saying that she's the only reason, but it just didn't work at the time. I found my way to energy work and how I can do, for instance, reconciliation with a person energetically.
Yes.
If I can't do it in reality, be it through geographical things or time and space because somebody's already dead, or it just communication doesn't allow it. And I think the experience that I made, and I have to say, Ida, at that point, I really sort of developed this all by myself.
Good.
So at that point, the kind of inner healing that I experienced through, and this was all sort of intuitively. Later on, of course, I had a lot of training and all these things came together and made even more sense. But this was probably also the starting point for me to even consider trying to help others. But it was mostly profound for me, and I'm talking I was like maybe 25.
Okay.
So that's almost 25 years ago, So from then, it still took me, another 10, 15 years.
So it took 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
As you did this work intuitively, you kind of developed your own system to be able to help others too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty much. I mean, at that point, I was still working as a coach in IT.
Okay.
And business coaching, and I did have a specialization in nutritional coaching, so I did that on the side. I volunteered a lot, worked with ADHD children, and helped families to cope with some of the issues that they have with some of the really common problems nowadays, how to resolve them nutritionally. But at that point, I was not into energy work, and it was more that I was starting to get interested in it. And so I started approaching it the same way I would approach chemistry or computer science.
Okay.
I picked teachers, PhDs, that were very mental. I picked a publishing company who was probably the most, successful in that area, And I picked all the people that I thought would be, the best in explaining it to me. And I have to say something completely kind of, it's not off the topic, but it may sound like it. When I was in university for chemistry, there was something I noticed. I was 18 years old. I'll never forget this. Is one of those like most spiritual moments in my life. I've always felt there's got to be more. The reason why I went for chemistry was that I thought physics was pretty limiting in explaining things, too static, too rigid. Chemistry be a little more fluid and there's more action there. But I still remained very unsatisfied by the explanations and by the things. And there were some things back then, over 30 years ago, like unified theory and stuff, those things just came up. And quantum physics was not even taught yet in university. It may have been different if I were in college now, but back then it was not satisfactory, and I was looking for more. I was looking for something that could explain to me how everything belongs together, not how you analyze everything and take everything apart. I knew I was really good at that, but it did not deliver the context. It just delivered content.
Okay.
And so when I started getting interested into energy work, and I'm saying energy work on purpose because it wasn't spiritual for me at all in the beginning. It was a total scientific kind of thing. And, like any program or any skill for me, you can learn this. So that's the way I approached it, very mental. So I did NLP, I did remote viewing, although remote viewing is a little different than the pure mental studies or teachings that are out there. And I think through that, which left me still in that same sort of unsatisfied state, I started looking for authors that combined, that were more metaphysical, that kind of looked at all of it together without going too much into detail, too much into content. I didn't want any more content. I knew just sort of mentally or intellectually that if I wanted to, I could go into any content. I didn't need to accumulate any more content. I wanted context. And that's when I found some really cool authors that sparked that whole sort of more sort of philosophizing, more like looking at, how does the human fit into this world, into this universe? What is the purpose and so forth? I didn't have a particularly religious upbringing, so I didn't have to bring it into a religious context, which turns out is a good thing today because I work with a lot of people who do have a lot of religious programming like yourselves and who need to work on getting some of these programs removed out of their system because they can be very dominating, be it for behavior or thinking structure, or finally coming back to critical inner voice, like constantly sort of looming supervisor in your head that judges what you do. And in order to resolve that critical inner voice, there's techniques for that, and I teach them too, and I do webinars about it and everything. But it's really what we need to do is first to accept or realize that we are not just a single sort of entity here on this planet with our very own mind, because that is probably one of the largest, biggest misunderstandings people have. They think their thoughts are their own. And energetically seen, that is absolutely not the case. We have a sort of personal translation programs in our head. And of course, they depend on our background, our experiences, and so forth, also our karmic setup. But thoughts, that whole entire sort of human field of thinkingness, which is often called, the human collective consciousness or unconsciousness, depending on how you look at it. And that is the driving force behind those thoughts. So, when we experience things like a constant critical inner voice, and just to say this, to clarify this, we're not talking about hearing voices. We're talking about sort of that inner dialogue that is constantly judging and bashing and comparing, right? When we want to work with that and heal with that, we have to first understand that a lot of these things are actually not from us. They're actually absorbed or assimilated or conditioned, actually, as you once said, through like the different sort of levels of community that we are in, that be siblings, parents, community, ethnic group, racial group, gender, collective group, country that we live in, and so forth, religion. Those are all factors that play a role. So your critical inner voice is probably a little different than mine, but the energy of it will be the exact same. So when we want to work with that, we first have to kind of recontextualize it and see, all right, I'm not just dealing with issues with myself, like, say, for example, self-worth issues or something like that. I'm also dealing with a whole set of programs here that came through my parents, their parents, and the church group that I was in, and so forth. And so, since we cannot change that, we cannot change other people, we have to change the way we process these things that come in from the outside. And that's where the critical inner voice plays a big role, because the critical inner voice is kind of like sort of the mouthpiece of the collective that we have been conditioned by. And like I said, that can be different depending on what kind of collective we've been conditioned by. So,
Jona, when you said earlier that when you're leaving your scientific world somewhat and you start to look at metaphysics and you look for some authors who speak to you, you found some good books. What were those? Who were those teachers, and how did you start to experiment a little more with the metaphysical realm?
Well, first of all, I did have sort of a basic humanistic education, in the old philosophers. I'm coming here from, I'm already interested in this, but I kind of find something with a bang. I had a personal friend brought me to a lecture of one of the authors, which is Stuart Wilde, who spoke about, back then, really interesting things. So, I've never heard anybody else talk about these things, some of the things that I just talked about, sort of tribal programming and the difference between how we perceive things and how they really are, and how things are changing, and how there's a whole different world, a whole different reality out there, that if we just sort of connect with our heart and tune into that, there's a whole microcosm there. And I'm like, yeah, sign me up. That's the one that I've been looking for. So this was 25 years ago, and that sparked my search from there. I've read a lot of different books, and I've purposefully tried to explore many different routes. There is very many great books in Buddhism, which of course is a bit mental, in my personal opinion, but a very high consciousness level. I've explored remote viewing. The teacher I had there, Lynn Buchanan, great teacher, and I've explored Dr. Hawkins, which is probably one of the most influential sort of metaphysical teachers that I had. I think what gave it the spark, though, and this is now a core thing, Ida. This was all sort of still mental, what I was doing, just studying things, gathering knowledge, the more, the better. And of course, I went into quantum mechanics and wanted to know all about that too. Not that I'm an expert, I'm not saying that, but with the scientific background, it was easier to read studies and stuff like that. But anyway, what was really missing was a component that allowed me to bring this all together with my inner feeling. At that point, it was all mental. It was all just knowledge. Mm-hmm. And even though some authors like Stuart Wilde and even Hawkins have a great sense of humor and made that studying a lot more joyful, the internalization, like me actually experiencing it and feeling it, that was still missing. And that came through my mentor, Patricia Sinclair, in Germany, who was at first my energy coach, and then strongly motivated. She trained me. She taught me a lot of energy work modalities that I could not read anywhere. And she brought in sort of the feminine component that I was missing until then. Cool. So most of the authors that I'd read were males and sort of broken down in sort of a very structural way, which I liked at that point. But Patricia brought in the feminine energetic aspect and allowed me to experience things in a very soft and gentle way. And I think looking back, that is probably when it really sort of started making all sense for me. I mean, I explored many other routes as well, plant medicines. I did courses in shamanism. I did courses in Native American healing and so forth, herbalism. I mean, like, you name it. Uh-huh. But those were all like sort of just knowledge gathering things. If I look at what I'm using today to support other people in their healing and self-healing, I don't really think that I'm using any of these things. Uh-huh. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe I do in a way that that it just all kind of came together. But this is something I'm encouraging people to do. And this is like when you ask for teachers or authors, I strongly recommend anyone that is just remotely interested in any kind of sort of out of their things to just go for it. It doesn't matter who you read. It doesn't matter which book you started with or which book you end with. It's the exposure. So energy work and spiritual healing happens through exposure. It happens osmotically. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does.
Anytime you talk to a person like we're doing right now is a spiritual and energetic event. Mm-hmm. There's an energy transfer between us, and that does something to you. And where you're going to go next, those are just sort of stepping stones. When I, sort of from that metaphysical point of view, when we look at like what are the different steps to get somewhere, that's a limited view. That's a linear, dualistic type of view. If we look at it the other way around, and Stuart Wilde, for example, was an expert in repeating over and over again, it's all backwards. It's all backwards. If you look at it from the context, say the context being your life's purpose, right? That you have no clue of. Right. And that you probably try to do everything to not do it. But if you begin to get interested in spiritual development and consciousness development and everything, you start opening up some of these channels. And if you have a good teacher will always tell you to seek for answers inwardly, to connect with your inner guidance and to connect with your heart to find answers. But anyway, once you start opening up these channels, what actually happens is that you are starting to be pulled by your purpose instead of pushed by your past.
Well, that's cool.
Does that make
Oh,
sense?
it not only makes sense, but I think it's, you not only pulled by your purpose, but even the books that you might pick up or whatever information you seek, it all makes sense anyway. You just go to what you need.
Absolutely. And the only real recommendation I could make is just listen to your inner feeling. Read, expose yourself, talk to people, and just if a book falls on your doorstep, read it. No matter what the title, what the author, those things all don't matter, because at a certain level of alignment with your true self and your purpose, things just fall into place. And the details, the content does not matter anymore. You'll be led to the right people, to the right places, to the right books, and right is not even the question anymore, because it's just sort of something that you needed on the way. And then tomorrow you need something different. And that's really, really important. And I know, of course, everyone wants to get a hands-on, tell me what to do sort of list. And it's, easier to do that. But at the end of the day, what you go for today is not bad tomorrow just because you have a new insight or a better understanding. So when on this journey, you will very soon find out that there's no need for comparison anymore. There is no need for judging what I did in the past.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah, because the truth of the matter is, I needed to experience that. I needed to read that book, see that person, have that kind of accident, have that disease, meet that guy, whatever it is that happened in your life, whether it was something that you then perceived as positive or negative, doesn't matter. You needed them all because they were all part of pulling you into your future, pulling you to your purpose. There's still a free will and all that, and it's very complex, the subject, but it's the general sort of inner prompting and conspiracy of circumstances to make all that happen that matters.
Conspiracy of circumstances. That's gorgeous. I like that.
Well, that's kind of like how it is, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? And also, you tend to drop things. You go through. I go through a stage where I might be studying a particular type of work for 6-7 years, and then all of a sudden I'm not attracted anymore, and I'm moving on to something else. But it all does what it does for you, and it just becomes a part of the package.
Absolutely, but what's really important in terms of healing work and spiritual consciousness work is that we learn not to look back and say, "Oh yeah, well that was back then," sort of in a judging way. The spiritual healing, spiritual consciousness develops through seeing it in context and appreciating everything that happened to us that we felt attracted to, even the negative experiences, and accepting them, like you said, as part of the package, as really important part of the package, as a matter of fact.
Right.
And if we then transpose that attitude to our present, to the moment, to right now, then it can become aware to us how important the moment is. Because what I appreciate right now, is something that I'm going to even more appreciate tomorrow. And when I'm not appreciating today, I may be able to appreciate that as, part of the package deal tomorrow. But that's sort of part of what, is sort of in conscious work is called transcendence. This is where how we learn to recontextualize things, not based on how we experience them, but what the meaning of them is.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
And so, yeah, I mean, the learning curve for consciousness work or spiritual work, and I'm not talking religious, I'm talking sort of, that's why I like to call it consciousness work, because it's a bit less limiting there, is to expand. It's just to simply expand and to be completely open to what happens. And knowing what I know today, that every little misery that I had in my life contributed greatly to the way I see things, who I am today, what I can do for myself, what I can do for my children, what I can do for other people.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get there, none of it needs to be judged anymore.
Absolutely. It's all a gift, and I've started talking to myself when something difficult comes up. I say, well, what's in this? What gift is there in this one for me? It's something I'm getting from this, and let's see what it is. How is this coming through?
That's very evolved, Ida. I don't know if I can do this every single time.
Well, it's a lot of tough stuff, so you just kind of get used to having a little different look at it. What is this gift? And, it's just a method that I have of getting through things. But I'm looking at my little notes here that I took before we finish. We had talked a little bit about previously about being energetically sensitive. So maybe we'll just talk about that. You were energetically sensitive as a child because you had to be. And, someone might be not even aware that they are sensitive to energies. And, how do you help people or instruct people, help them understand what it is they're being sensitive to, and so on when they talk about being picking up on energies?
First of all, I want to make a quick comment. It's really difficult to find people who are energetically sensitive, not because there aren't many out there, on the contrary, but because energetically sensitive persons tend to not talk about their energetic sensations.
Uh-huh.
And this is kind of like, if I just backtrack a little bit, this is kind of like where the problem is, and then that explains where I help people. One of them, probably the most common sort of things that people who are energetically sensitive experience is that they think they're the only ones.
Mm-hmm.
Not as in special, but as in like nobody can understand me.
Uh-huh.
They don't fit in. Mm-hmm. They have not fit in since childhood. And they see things differently. Yeah. And that, of course, after we talked about critical inner voice and conditioning and all that, is a perfect setup for a rough life.
It is, isn't it?
It is. Whether it's in career, in personal relationships, you name it. Yeah. They typically have really cool pets, because with animals, we feel free. We feel free to interchange. We feel free to sort of nourish that energetic sensitivity, but not with people. Mm. So one of the biggest problems is talking about what we're experiencing, because we secretly believe that everybody thinks we're crazy. And knowing what I know from counseling and how that is taught, our suspicion is correct. So for energetically sensitive people, for most of the sensations that they have, they would probably be labeled in some way. So it's the overall sort of collective development right now and the energy shifts that are occurring right now that are sort of driving the people out of the woodwork.
Mm-hmm.
Because more and more people are starting to talk about it. And transcodes, you mentioned it in the beginning, is sort of my life work is a platform for people that are energetically sensitive, because the biggest issue, or what helps the most in the beginning, is to simply have someone to talk about these things that you could not talk about your entire life. And very sadly, for most people, as a result, had to shut down their sensitivity, their energetic perception, which in return, and this is kind of like the crossover, can create a lot of mental problems and emotional problems. So if I'm a very energetically sensitive person and I can feel things, and I'm not talking necessarily just precognition, but I can feel things that are going on. You and I talked about this. You have the same thing. You talk to someone and you hear their voice saying something, and at the same time you feel something completely different.
Right.
Being transported. And it's a skill, it's an ability that we all have as humans. It comes with the human package to have that sensitivity. It's just that we tend to shut it down because it is not acceptable in most societies. There are a few societies, or there were societies like tribal societies, indigenous societies, where it is promoted, where it's asked for, where it's cultivated from childhood. But in our Western world, say, it is not. It is something that is threatening. It is something that needs to be shut down. It starts with the monsters we see in the closet when we're 3 or 4 years old, and the imaginary friend, things like that, seeing fairies and so forth. Those, of course, are sort of childhood stages of developing perception. But if we are told in a very early stage that this is all sort of bullshit and that we have to shut it down and that's not real, right? Well, how do you grow up? What kind of critical inner voice do you develop? If you have these sensations, okay, and the voice keeps on telling you, that's not real, that's not real, that's not real. So you starting to feel not real. And then you start to question your everything. I mean, at some point, we question reality altogether.
Yeah.
And so one of the sort of first steps of sort of supporting people is to actually give them a platform, give them a forum, give them a place to talk, give them a place to read other people's experiences too. One of the most healing things ever. It's one thing when you talk to a coach and you've developed a relationship and you trust this person and you know them, but it's another thing if you actually read experiences from like random people that you don't know.
Right, like on the forum and so on.
Yes, that goes so deep, and you're like, oh my God, yes, I've had that all my life, and I had no idea other people experience similar things. And, just for clarification purposes for your listeners, we're talking about anything that is kind of extrasensory here, and this can be anything from lucid dreaming and like really strong visioning to, yes, precognition is also part of that, but visioning is actually not everybody's forte. Most people are actually more sensitive in a tactile way, so they feel things in their body. And they feel when another person is down, or they feel it after they've been with a person. So there's a lot of sort of gray areas, a lot of subtle feelings that we're talking about. And energy work is a really cool tool to give that a little bit of structure and understand what is actually going on.
so that you can trust what you're feeling. And I know
Exactly.
many years went by where I would feel things and then I would talk myself out of it. Well, that can't be real. That can't be. I'm feeling this thing from this person, but they're saying an entirely different thing, so I must be wrong. And you gradually, after enough time passes and you look at it truthfully, you can pick up on what's really behind that person. That person is sitting there talking to me. The words coming out are one thing. The energy I'm feeling is another thing. But what's going on in his heart is totally different. It's a very tender, insecure kind of thing.
Right. And this affects everything in life. It affects our choices of jobs, places where we live, and relationship partners. So the practical application now, is to put this to work, these sensations, and to discern what they mean for us and how we can base our day-to-day choices or life's choices on that. With that trust, then, as you mentioned, develops a whole different self-understanding.
Right.
So we're, in the old days, I would sort of have certain friends that I knew that I could only talk to in the morning. If I talked to them in the evening, they've already had a few drinks, and that would just make me feel miserable after I talked to them. They're still friends, but their energy just made me miserable. And some of the people that we really can't get along with, we don't really know why, and so forth. So when we start trusting our inner signaling system, then we get really specific messages, and that is not just about other people. You wouldn't believe it, but most of the questions that I get or assistance that people need is, I feel terrible in the workplace that I'm at. And it's not the work itself, but it is either something with the building or something with the people that I work with. It makes me miserable. And when I come home, I'm shut down. I have no life force left over for my relationship, for my family, for creativity or anything like that. So that's where practical application comes in.
So there you go. So now there's a whole nother level that you're teaching them how to exist in that environment without being impacted in that way?
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes also to help them make choices to switch, or to break up relationships or whatever. Because sometimes the energetic impact is so strong that it'd be too much energy trying to compensate for it.
Okay. All right.
I'm saying this in a diplomatic way, but sometimes it's just simply better to shift the energy, to move to a different place or to take a different job, or if we can, and this is, of course, the majority of my work is helping people in relationships to apply these things. So if we can, and if both parties involved are willing to make changes, then there's a lot that can be done with energetic sensitivity, with energetic training, and applying that into communicational ways. Now, if I work in a workplace, like say somewhere in a corporate environment, and I work in my cubicle and that's what my position is, I don't really have a lot of ability to control that, to change that. Right? I mean, I can change the job or the employer, but I can't really change the setting. In a relationship, it's a little different.
Yes.
And that's where it all comes to play. Everything, whether it's our critical inner voice, our inner child, our traumas, our energetic sensitivity, and all the coping mechanisms and protection mechanisms that we've developed, they all play out in our relationships.
Oh, I love it. Jona, we're probably going to, let's see, we're at almost an hour, and I love where we ended here. Would you have anything you'd like to close out with, or we can just talk about your website and so on, and make sure that people know how to come there?
Well, I mean, the relationship part is really important to me. And if I want to conclude here, I would say that from my experience, and this is partly my personal experience, but also my energetic perception and the experience as a coach, any type of journey that we do, no matter where it leads us, finds its application and its expression in our relationships.
It does, indeed.
Not just our romantic relationships or, with our kids or parents, or the relationship between anything that we come in contact with.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that we could come in contact with can be, it can be a tree, it can be an animal, anything with consciousness, so to speak, which includes a lot more than we normally think it does. But that's where it happens. Isolation, or sort of concluding that the world is bad and fearful and all people are evil, is not really conducive to our spiritual journey, to our consciousness development.
Mm-hmm.
Isolation can help us to maybe transcend certain things and to work on things for ourselves, just like when somebody goes into reclusion, to study something or whatever. But spirituality is a subjective science in quotation marks. There is no objectivity in consciousness and spiritualism. So the only way to internalize, to make it our own and to experience things, is to go into the subjective realm. And that's probably the biggest problem for all of us, because we're so conditioned and so trained to look at things as like you said, real or make sense, or, things have to be in a certain way. And that's the biggest problem for most of us to overcome. So isolation is not a solution, and that's all I want to say. And if somebody needs help, that's part of the services that I offer. I'm there 24/7, because sometimes this subjective experience can be a very extreme experience. It can, bring us into emotional crisis and so forth. So a big part of my coaching services is being there when a person is in need.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Nice.
Other than that, I can only say that the work that I've been doing in my practice for the last 10 years, and also in cooperation with my partner, Jeff Casper, we've developed a program, like a self-training program for people that allows them to go through some of the most common sort of layers and steps of their own inner healing and reconciliation work. And it's accompanied, so we're always there, and there's a forum with it and all that. But it helps a person, especially someone who's not yet used to talking to others, or not yet ready to actually do coaching work, for instance, who just wants to read something different and work with something different. The Sacred Self-Healing course is a really cool tool for that, because it's based on meditations and a little bit of theoretical work, but mostly sort of internalizing certain aspects of self.
Yeah, I can give a thumbs up to that too, because I've taken that course, or I'm taking it. It's really super cool, and I can say it also. Like I told you the other day, just to enter into it resolved a lot for me. In the first four, what do you call them, sessions that came through, were just propelled me right to into my heart center, and it was really nice. And I have to thank you for that. That's had an effect on my life, and
Well, thank you for your trust, Ida.
Oh, you're most welcome. It's super. It's really nice. And your voice and Jeff's voice are really good for guided meditations too. I enjoy both of you, and the way that your voice comes across and the music that you include with it. Mm-hmm. It's excellent. So, well, I'm gonna cause us to end this. I'm gonna put this on a time to end, and I want people to check out your website at transcodes with an S.
Yes, ma'am.
.com. And thank you, Jona. What a pleasure. And we'll be listening to this on YouTube soon. Okay?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Ida, and for giving me a chance to talk about these things, and for your interest in what I have to say.
And thank you to
a pleasure for me, too. Yeah, thank you.
Everybody, thanks for listening. And maybe we'll come and do it again, find a subject that everybody wants to hear about, and we'll talk again, if that'd be all right.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to say goodbye, and then we can talk later, all right?